Welcome back. It's a pleasure for me to introduce our last but not least speaker, Paolo Broggio. Paolo Broggio is a full professor of early modern history in the Department of Humanities at Roma University, where he teaches history of Europe and the Mediterranean, and politics and society in early modern world. His research interests have focused on the pastoral care and evangelization strategies of religious orders from a global perspective, the theological debates within the Catholic Church and their political implication, with a specific focus on the diplomatic relations between Rome and Madrid, and more recently on peacemaking in the theories and practices of criminal justice in early modern Europe. He is the author of the monographs Evangelizzare il mondo, le missioni della Compagnia di Gesù tra Europa e America, secoli XVI e XVII, prefaced by Cantu, la teologia e la politica, controversie dottrinali, curia romana e monarchia spagnola tra il 5 e 600, Florence. And the recent book is Governare l'odio, pace e giustizia criminale nell'Italia moderna. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Antje and Giulia, for the invitation. It is a real pleasure to be here in this wonderful conference. I will start with a recent event. On October 7th, 2019, during the Synod on the Amazon, a statue of Pachamama was carried in procession from St. Peter's Basilica to the hall where the Synod sessions were being held. Pope Francis welcomed the gift presented to him with a gesture of blessing towards the statue, which depicted a woman kneeling and bowing her head while carrying a child in her womb. This act was enough to provoke the outrage of ultra-conservatives who accused the Pope of blessing an idolatrous object. In the pantheon of indigenous religions of South America, Pachamama is a deity synonymous with Mother Nature. The outrage was so intense that shortly afterward, an Austrian ultra-conservative Catholic activist named Alexander Zugel entered the church of Santa Maria in Traspontina at night, where the statue was being kept at that time, stole it, and in a gesture of iconoclasm, threw the statue into the Tiber, the river Tiber. So I think this is enough because, okay, in the months following the incident, defenders of the Pope were quick to clarify that Pachamama is not a goddess or a deity, but rather a symbol of Amazonian realities and experiences with motivations not only cultural, but also religious, though not of worship, as worship is due only to God. As stated in an interview with the newspaper Avvenire by the Bishop Emeritus of San Cristobal de las Casas in Mexico, Felipe Arismendi Esquivel. Therefore, according to supporters of Pope Francis, there was no idolatrous worship. His opponents, however, held a different view. For instance, Mexican priest Hugo Valdemar, in the weeks following the incident, literally set fire to 3 Pachamama statues inside his parish, declaring that the place for Pachamama is in hell. According to him and many others, the deity Pachamama is essentially a manifestation of the devil. Why am I beginning my paper with such a recent event? Because in the history of the evangelization of South America, the figure of Pachamama has always been intimately connected and associated with that of the Virgin Mary. Religious syncretism quickly manifested itself, especially at the iconographic level, and was substantially accepted, not just tolerated by American ecclesiastical authorities. The Catecismo Mayor, in the form of questions and answers produced by the Third Provincial Council of Lima in 1582-1583, was very clear in its condemnation of the worship offered to various elements of nature. For the sun, the moon, the stars, this is the question. For the sun, the moon, the stars, the thunder, the mountain peaks and the rivers, springs and fertile land, and the other things that the ancient Indians worshipped, are they not God? The answer is none of these are God. And whoever worships them angers God and takes away his honor committing against him a grave sin and offence. Perhaps it is precisely for this reason that the blending of the Virgin Mary with Pachamama, along with other products of Catholic Andean syncretism, was permitted and even utilized. It served as a way to redirect an ancient form of worship towards the adoration of the Mother of Jesus. In the same catechism, Jesus was described as a man conceived by the Holy Spirit and who was born from the virginal womb of the Holy Virgin Mary, being a virgin before, during, and after childbirth. Just as in Europe, American ecclesiastical and civil authorities gave a significant push to the spread of Marian devotion in the New World, targeting indigenous and black populations. As is well known, various aspects of Marian worship are related to gender, female sexuality, reproduction, childbirth, and even family. One famous late medieval example is the fresco painted in 1455 by Piero della Francesca, the Madonna del Parto, currently housed in a museum in Monterchi in the province of Arezzo. Although the name Madonna del Parto typically refers to depictions of Mary with the newborn Jesus, this particular fresco portrays Mary as a pregnant woman, a pregnant Mary. Adriano Prosperi notes that already starting from the 15th century, there was a growing discomfort within ecclesiastical circles regarding Mary's physicality, regarding her body and her pregnancy. Theologian Jean Gerson criticized an image of a pregnant Madonna included in a Trinity painting at the Carmelite convent in Paris. Similarly, in the 17th century, the vicar of the diocese of Osnabrück, not far from here, banned a procession featuring the image of a pregnant Madonna who was brought into individual homes to bless marital beds. Let me show just a couple of images to give you an example of the late medieval iconography of the Madonna giving birth, portrayed as pregnant and not as carrying a newborn Jesus in her arms. So this is one of the 14th century. You know, it's a visibly pregnant virgin, and the other one is this. Okay, Madonna giving birth, 14th century. Undoubtedly, from the late 15th century through the Tridentine and Baroque periods, there was a gradual iconographic obscuring of the image of a pregnant Madonna. Nevertheless, the specific Marian title of the Virgin of Hope, Virgen de la Esperanza, of the expectancy, de la expectación, or of sweet way, de la dulce espera, also known as the Virgin de la O, Virgin of the O, later I will explain why, which refers to Mary's pregnancy, continued to spread widely throughout the Hispanic world, including Spanish Italy and all of the New World. Women expecting a child turned to her for protection and comfort. It was the Council of Toledo in 656 that established the Feast of the Virgin of Expectancy, a sort of echo of the Feast of the Annunciation, March 25th. A date too close to Easter and within Lent. This feast had to be celebrated on December 18th. Why this name, Virgin of the O, Virgen de la O? Because on the evening of December 18th, the breviary service begins with the words O sapientia veni, O wisdom come. And in the following day, with expressions that also start with the exclamation O in Latin, O Adonai, O Emmanuel, and so Virgin of the O. Therefore, it is certainly true that the ecclesiastical hierarchies started to be uncomfortable with the image of the pregnant Madonna, but not so uncomfortable with the image, but not with this specific devotion itself, at least not everywhere in Europe, because in the Hispanic world it remained strong, even though from an iconographic standpoint, representations of the Virgin in weight during the early modern era were very different from those, even though not so common, of the 14th and 15th centuries, where pregnancy was depicted with all its physicality. Consider Piero della Francesca's fresco with the Virgin's slightly lateral pose and the posture of her body designed to highlight the size of her abdomen. From the 16th to the 18th century, depictions of pregnant Madonnas became fewer, and the physical detail of the swollen belly was much less pronounced compared to the late Middle Ages. For example, this one, Our Lady of Expectancy, Spain, and this other one, the belly is not so evident. I mean, so in Christian thought, it is in the early modern era that we reach a decisive stage in the process of sterilizing the maternal and maternity by obscuring the corporeality of pregnancy and childbirth, increasingly understood in a symbolic rather than physical sense. As Nadia Maria Filippini writes, while Christianity has exalted the figure of the Virgin Mary, it has also developed a theological construct aimed at purifying her figure of the traces of corporeal motherhood, exempting her from the pains of childbirth, from blood and suffering, which are instead reserved to Eve, for Eve and her descendants. The focus increasingly shifted to the spiritual and symbolic aspects of maternity, an unembodied maternal function, Mary as sponsa Dei, mater ecclesiae. With the doctrine of Mary's perpetual virginity, Christian theology provided an explanation for the mystery of the incarnation of the Son of God. A similar necessity arose regarding the transmission of original sin. Excluding the possibility that this transmission could occur, in her case, through the male seed, it was essential to ensure that Mary herself, whose womb received the incarnate God, was pure and free from the stain of original sin, possibly from the very moment of her own conception in the womb of her mother, Saint Anne. The question I ask myself is, what aspects of these elaborate doctrinal constructs were transmitted to the New World from a pastoral, catechetical, devotional, liturgical, and theological perspective at the beginning of the evangelization process? What gender meanings did devotion to the Virgin and the Immaculate Conception convey in the American and in particular Andean world, within indigenous and black societies? What syncretism, if any, emerged? The American viceroyalties were immediately affected by the controversies that erupted in Spain from the principal Andalusian cities between 1614 and 1617 concerning the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception of Mary. In Granada and in Seville, some Dominican friars, during their sermons, had denied that Mary was conceived without sin from the very first moment. These led to actual popular uprisings spurred on by rival religious orders, namely the Franciscans and the Jesuits. The first extraordinary diplomatic mission was sent to Rome by Philip III to request the Pope to define the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, so to define the Immaculate Conception as a dogma of the Church. In the summer of 1617, as the mission of the Benedictine friar Placido de dos Santos in Rome was coming to an end, and celebrations in honor of the Immaculate Conception continued unabated in Spain, similar festivities and processions took place in Lima, lasting for more than 2 months until the end of September. These festivities ultimately became expressions of gratitude and joy for Paul V's promulgation of the Constitution Sanctissimus on August 31st, 1617, which prohibited declaring in any public acts, whether among the common people or the learned, that the Virgin was conceived in original sin. An interesting aspect, beyond the desire of Lima's civil and ecclesiastical society to emulate what was happening in the Iberian Peninsula and to underline the full membership of the viceroyalty of Peru in the Spanish monarchy from a religious and ideological standpoint, is that these celebrations were organized by the congregation of the Virgen de la O, Virgin of the O. The doctrine of the Immaculate Conception does not refer to Mary's pregnancy, but the ideal association between Mary's pregnancy and her own Immaculate Conception was clearly perceivable and, in my opinion, carried interesting symbolic implications. It was about affirming the absolute purity of the bodies of two women, not all women, both in terms of the act of conception and the flesh destined to receive the flesh, I mean God's flesh. On one hand, Mary, who was a virgin before, during, and after the conception of God, of the Son of God, and free from original sin from her own conception. On the other hand, her mother, Saint Anne, who, while not having conceived Mary virginally, carried in her womb a woman destined to receive the incarnate Word. These highlighted the purity of the flesh, the purity of conception, with very little attention given to the physicality of childbirth. How does the connection between the Virgin Mary and Pachamama establish itself in the New World, particularly from an iconographic standpoint? How is this visually manifested? One way could have been through the image of the pregnant Virgin, thus representing the giver of life. However, as previously mentioned, the Tridentine and post-Tridentine Church tended to blur her corporeality, focusing instead on the symbolic aspects of Mary's motherhood and the wait for Jesus. As seen at the beginning of this paper, Pachamama is still typically depicted today as a pregnant woman. But Catholic Andean syncretism took a different path. Many representations of Mary in the Andean Americas feature a distinctly triangular silhouette, something not commonly found in Europe. The triangle, formed by her clock, clearly alludes to the mountains, a dominant and characteristic element of the Andean landscape, which indigenous cultures associated with Mother Nature. A famous example is the painting from the Cusco School of popular art in the 18th century, which depicts the Virgin Mary integrated into the Cerro de Potosí, a mining site of extraordinary importance in colonial Peru. This site was a symbol of immense wealth, but also of the horrific exploitation of indigenous labor. In the painting, the Virgin's triangular form represents her being much like Pachamama or the Huacas, the Andean indigenous idols, as housed within the mountain. This triangular shape became typical of Andean iconography of the Virgin Mary, cultivated by indigenous and mestizo artisans. For example, this one, triangle, and this one also. One of these triangular Madonnas is quite interesting, and I refer to this one. It is the Virgin of Cocharcas in the southern Peruvian region of Apurimac, where a sanctuary was built between 1598 and 1623. Here you can see two different versions of the same Virgin, the Virgin of Cocharcas, and in the one of right, we can see the half moon at the feet of Mary. The iconographic reference to the Immaculate Conception is confirmed by the cartouche, the inscription above, where we can read Macula originalis non est in te, a mixture of iconographic elements which probably represents a typically Andean devotional hybridization, as witnessed by the image of the Virgin of the Cerro de Potosí. So the half moon is typical of the Immaculate Conception images, and the cartoon says, it's not visible, but it says Macula originalis. So it's a mixture between a simple Virgin and the Immaculate Conception. In this instance, the Virgin as mountain, I refer to the other image, has a sphere at her feet, similarly to many images of the Immaculate Conception, where the sphere symbolized the moon. For example, in other images here, so the moon is not complete, it's not the whole moon, but only a part of the moon, which is typical of the images of the Immaculate Conception. But also in Europe, for example, if you see Francisco de Zurbarán painting of the Immaculate Conception and Rubens, Peter Paul Rubens' Immaculate Conception, the moon is complete, even though there is a part which is much lighter than the other. However, there are two important differences, referring to the image of the Cerro de Potosi. We come back to that. Within the sphere are depicted snow-capped mountains, as you can see, a clear reference to the Andes, while to the right and left appear Charles V and the Roman pontiff, Pope Paul III Farnese. The Latin inscription, only partially legible, reads, His Holiness Paul III, Charles V, King of the Catholic Holy Empire, greatest emperor, the year 1520. The anonymous author, most likely of indigenous or mestizo origin, intended to evoke the beginning of the Spanish colonization of the American continent. Hernán Cortés' expedition began as you know, in 1519, and Montezuma was captured and imprisoned at the end of that year, under the auspices of the emperor and the pope. However, he mistakenly referenced the wrong pope, because in 1520 the reigning pope was Leo X. This seemingly gross historical error is not accidental at all, in my opinion, as Paul III Farnese, who ascended to the papacy in 1534, was the author of the bull Sublimis Deus, 1537, which advocated for the protection of the New World's indigenous peoples and against the excesses of the Spanish domination. Therefore, this image of the Virgin incorporates some characteristics of European iconography of the Immaculate Conception. It lacks the blue mantle, the crown of stars, and the crescent moon with the tips facing up or facing down, upon which the Immaculate Virgin is usually depicted, floating between heaven and earth. However, there's still a sphere at her feet, emphasizing that the Virgin of the Cerro de Potosi, like the mountains, connects heaven and earth. The sphere with the mountains inside is the form in which the Christianized indigenous writer Juan de Santa Cruz Pachacuti Yamgui depicts Pachamama in his work Relación de Antigüedades de este Reino del Perú, dated around 1613. Within this detailed refutation of traditional idolatry, the Relación, made more severe by the author's status as a Christian neophyte, there is a drawing that summarizes Andean cosmology and includes Pachamama, as you can see from the image. The core of the Relación is the claim of an Andean Christianity that existed before the arrival of the Spaniards, attributed to the preaching of the Apostle St. Thomas, a myth that gained significant traction at the time, partly thanks to the efforts of the Jesuits. And if you can, as you can see here, here. This is Pachamama, which is a sphere with mountains inside. Numerous studies focus on the spread of Marian devotion in the New World, but the historiography specifically addressing the veneration of the Immaculate Conception and the involvement of American viceroyalties in the debates of the 17th century, especially concerning the dogmatic definition and its political implications, is much less abundant. René Millar Carvaccio has highlighted how the winter celebrations in Lima in 1617 were initiated by the viceroy, who used the occasion to bolster his image as a devout and effective governor committed to the Virgin and the Immaculate Conception. This initiative was supported by prominent members of the city's elite and religious orders, with crucial operational backing from the artisan guilds. This environment was closely tied to the University of San Marcos, the powerful Jesuit order, and the Franciscan order. Millar also notes the participation in the ceremonies by indigenous people and castas, with the confraternities designated for them. We found ourselves in an urban context where religious ceremonies served as a powerful tool for religious and cultural homogenization, particularly on a symbolic level in a society marked by deep inequalities and tensions. However, in catechesis specifically aimed at indigenous peoples, there is no precise reference to the doctrine of Immaculate Conception of the Virgin. attention is entirely focused on the virginity of Mary, a dogma whose knowledge by the indigenous people is considered indispensable, as explained by Alonso de la Peña Montenegro in his Itinerario para párrocos de Inuit. Just as in Spain, from the beginning of the 17th century, there was a popularization of the doctrinal dispute over the Immaculate Conception, but not to the extent of actively involving the indigenous people, considered perhaps incapable of fully grasping the religious significance of the purity of Mary's conception, not of Jesus, but of Mary herself. And from the perspective not of the sexual intercourse, but of the non-transmission of original sin. At the celebrations of 1617, indigenous peoples and castas were indeed present, but most likely without a real understanding of their purpose. In catechetical texts, in sermons, Mary is generally referred to as pure, more because she is a virgin, before, during, and after the conception of Jesus, and not because she was conceived without sin. According to Peña Montenegro, for indigenous peoples to be saved, in order to be saved, it is sufficient to believe that Christ is our Saviour and Glorifier, who was conceived by the most pure Virgin by the work of the Holy Spirit, who was born and died, and then rose again and ascended to heaven, where there is immortal life for the good. A few lines later, when discussing the Trinity, he writes that there is no need for the indigenous people to understand how it is possible that, being three distinct persons, God is one. I quote, "It is enough for them to understand that these words are true, even if they do not know the foundation in depth, which is left for theologians." However, the confusion between the Immaculate Conception and the virginity of Mary became common in Europe and in Spain as well, without causing any particular concern on the part of the Church. In the transmission of gender, sexual, reproductive, and family models, even in the New World, devotion to the Virgin and the Immaculate Conception played a very important role, especially considering how much attention, particularly in the New World, ecclesiastical authorities devoted to controlling sexuality and marital issues. Evidence of this is the greater flexibility with which the rules regarding canonical prohibitions for kinship and affinity were applied in America, and also the enormous amount of doubts, dubia, requests for clarification, that reached Rome precisely from the mission lands. As Adriano Prosperi wrote regarding the debates on the Immaculate Conception throughout the early modern period, I quote, "In the representations and explanations of the conception of the Madonna, and that from which her divine Son was born, overall changes are reflected in the relationship between Christian society and the role of women as mothers. The protagonist of this change was the family, upon which political and religious powers focused to discipline its forms of functioning. What is certain is that the idea of purity was closely linked to the struggle against idolatry, a deadly danger for Catholic orthodoxy and the salvation of the souls of the indigenous people. In most of the images circulating at the time, the Virgin, as Immaculate Conception, had her feet on the sphere of the moon, crushing a serpent's head. Among the many significances, the serpent can be easily identified as idolatry. It is not by chance that the Archbishop of Lima, who promoted the celebrations of 1617, was the same one who only a few years earlier had initiated the first massive campaign to eradicate indigenous idolatry, a sort of episcopal inquisition for indigenous people in which the Jesuits actively collaborated. Insisting on female purity, especially from a sexual, reproductive, and family perspective, also meant transmitting a very specific political model pivoting on the concept of male honor. In the sermon delivered by the Jesuit Nicola Duran Mastrilli in the Church of the Society of Jesus in Lima during the aforementioned celebration of 1617, The enumeration of the merits of the Spanish monarchy in the defense of and spread of the cult of the Immaculate Conception even touches upon the so-called tablets of Granada, artifacts that were believed to date back to the Apostolic Age and would have proven the Christian Arabic roots of Spanish Catholicism. Let's briefly recall what the lead books of Granada, Libri di Piombo, the Lamine di Granada, the lead books of Granada are. These are objects and texts that were reportedly found near Granada at two different times, in 1588, during the demolition of an ancient minaret, when a leaden box containing a parchment was unearthed. The parchment had a text prophesying the end of the world, attributed to St. John the Evangelist, with allusions to Muhammad and Luther. Also found were a relic of St. Stephen and a cloth with an inscription claiming that it was used by Mary to wipe away her son's tears. In 1595, another discovery was made, this time on the Sacromonte hill near Granada. It involved a series of lead tablets inscribed with texts in a strange form of Arabic. These texts spoke of a figure named Saint Ctesiphon, an Arab from the time of Nero, who converted to Christianity, and a text titled Liber Fundamentorum Ecclesiae, which defined Mary as preserved from original sin. The explicit reference to the Granada tablets in Lima celebrations is a clear sign of how a large portion of Spanish society, but also Spanish-American society at the time, undoubtedly considered these books authentic, when in fact Rome, a few decades later, would decree them as fakes, the work of Moorish craftsmen who, a few years before their expulsion from Spain, desperately tried to be considered an integral part of the Spanish society, albeit with their religious specificities. This provided a vivid testimony of a sector of Hispanic Catholicism that was willing to integrate religious minorities and that also based its foundations on the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. This is what Juan de Santa Cruz Pachacuti Yanqui mentioned earlier, and Felipe Guamán Poma de Ayala did on the other side of the Atlantic, mutatis mutandis, and exactly during the same years, the same period, which proves crucial in the process of constructing the Catholic monarchy, steadfastly built upon the ideology of purity that wanted Spanish Catholicism, Spanish even before Roman, to be free from the stain of heresy and idolatry, which adopted the Eucharist and the Immaculate Conception as powerful symbols of power. But it was an illusion because reality was made up of religious and cultural syncretisms. It was made of hybrid Christian religion, actively and consciously reworked, reclaimed, which demanded recognition. In conclusion, I would like to draw your attention on this last image, taken from Felipe Guamán Poma de Ayala, Nueva Crónica y Buen Gobierno. It is quite interesting from our perspective, because in the not so many images of Mary in Poma de Ayala's Nueva Crónica, one of the few is this Virgin of Peña de Francia, a special Marian title corresponding to the Nativity of Mary, not her conception, but Nativity. Its cult developed in a Dominican convent near Salamanca in Spain and was born following a Marian apparition which occurred in 1434, involving Simone Vela, the Frenchman Simon Roland. The Virgin of Peña de Francia is a black Madonna. Celebrating the Nativity of Mary, its feast falls on September the 8th, 9 months after the feast celebrating her conception. The cult also spread in colonial Peru during the 16th century. Thank you very much for your attention.